Clara Whitmore pressed her hand flat against the cold marble column and did not move. 10 feet away, her husband laughed with his guests. She had spent 6 months learning his coffee order, smoothing his household, swallowing her longing like medicine, and tonight she finally heard what he truly thought of her. She is a debt settled in silk, nothing more. If you've ever been in a room full of people and felt completely invisible, you need to stay until the very end of this story. Subscribe to our channel. Drop the name of your city in the comments, and let me see how far this story travels. The summer of 1816 arrived in Virginia the way grief sometimes does, slowly, quietly, and without mercy. Ashford Hall stood 3 miles east of Richmond on a rise of land that had made men ambitious for 3 generations. The white columns of the house caught the morning light like something out of a painting, and the grounds stretched far enough that a person could walk for an hour and never reach the fence line. Nathaniel Ashford had inherited all of it at 22 when his father died of a fever, and he had grown into his ownership the way a man grows into a coat that was always slightly too large, with effort, with pride, and with something underneath that never quite fit. I was 34 now, a widower, respected in every county parlor and dinner table from Richmond to Charlottesville. People said Nathaniel Ashford was a serious man, a measured man, a man who had loved once and buried it and moved on with the discipline of someone who understood that grief, like debt, had to be managed before it consumed everything. Clara had believed that once. She had believed quite a few things in the beginning. She was 26, the eldest daughter of Thomas Whitmore, a Richmond merchant whose business had collapsed the winter before in a cascade of bad investments and borrowed money that came due all at once. The shame of it had fallen on the family like a roof caving in, sudden, total, and impossible to pretend hadn't happened. Clara's 2 younger sisters had gone to live with an aunt in Fredericksburg. Her mother had taken to her bed with what the doctor called nerves and what Clara privately recognized as heartbreak. Thomas Whitmore had done the only thing a ruined man with a daughter of marriageable age could do in 1816 Virginia. He had gone to Nathaniel Ashford with his hat in his hands and his debts on the table. The arrangement had been settled in a single afternoon. Nathaniel would pay Thomas Whitmore's debts in full, $1,400, a sum that represented everything the Whitmore family owed and more. In exchange, Clara would become the second Mrs. Ashford. There was no courtship. There was a brief meeting in her father's sitting room where Nathaniel shook her hand, said she seemed sensible, and left within the hour. Clara had stood at the window and watched his horse carry him down the road and told herself that sensible was enough. That kindness could grow from proximity. That a man who paid a stranger's debts without cruelty was at least a man worth trying to know. She had been wrong. Not about his character, about what he wanted from her. He wanted nothing, not unkindly. That was the hardest part. Nathaniel was never cruel to her in those first 6 months. He was simply absent, present in body and nowhere in intention. He nodded when she spoke. He thanked her when she managed the household. He sat across from her at dinner 3 times a week and ate his food and answered her questions with the brief, courteous efficiency of a man who had somewhere else to be in his own mind. She learned his habits because she had nothing else to hold on to. He took his coffee black, no sugar, before sunrise. He rode the East Fields on Tuesdays and Thursdays. He did not like music at dinner, but tolerated it on Sundays. He kept the door to Rebecca's old music room closed and had not in 6 months opened it once. Rebecca. Clara knew very little about her, except what servants whispered and what portraits told. She had been beautiful in the way that certain women are beautiful, with a quality that made rooms rearrange themselves around her. She had died 3 years ago of a lung illness that came on slowly and took her over the course of a winter. And Nathaniel had never once in 6 months of marriage to Clara spoken her name aloud. That silence told Clara everything she needed to know about where she stood. She was not a wife. She was a placeholder, a manageable arrangement in the shape of a woman. She had tried in those early months to bridge the distance. She asked him questions about the estate. She stayed awake when he came in late from riding the fields and offered him a glass of water without making it feel like surveillance. She arranged the dining room with summer flowers from the garden because she had heard from the housekeeper that Rebecca had loved flowers, and she thought perhaps the house missed color. Nathaniel had looked at the flowers and said, That was unnecessary. Not mean. Just closed. She stopped bringing flowers after that. The night of the midsummer gathering at Ashford Hall came on the 20th of July. It was a formal dinner by Virginia standards. 40 guests, candlelight, the kind of heavy silver and pressed linen that announced to the county that Ashford Hall was still standing and still mattered. Clara had spent 3 days preparing it. She had ordered the kitchen settled, the seating corresponded with 3 households about dietary preferences, and altered her own pale blue silk gown herself, because her allowance did not stretch to a new dressmaker, and she was too proud to ask Nathaniel for more. She thought she looked well. She thought the evening looked well. She stood near the edge of the room in the early part of the evening and watched the guests move through the candlelight and told herself that this managing something beautifully invisibly was enough. Then she heard him near the fireplace. She was behind one of the wide marble columns that flanked the east side of the room. She had stepped there a moment before to check that the footman near the drinks table was doing his job, and she had not yet moved away when she heard the laughter, low and social. And then a man's voice she recognized as Henry Caldwell, one of Nathaniel's oldest acquaintances from their school days. "Your new bride looks proud tonight, Ashford." Caldwell's voice carried the easy amusement of a man 3 glasses deep. "Has marriage finally softened you?" She did not hear Nathaniel move. He did not come toward her. He did not turn from the fire. "She is not my bride in the way people imagine," he said. His voice was even almost bored. "She is a debt settled in silk, nothing more." The men around him laughed. The violins kept playing. Clara stood behind the marble column, with her hand pressed flat against its surface, and did not move for a very long time. She was not sure how many seconds passed before she was able to breathe again. She was aware of the candle flames and the music and the sound of 40 people moving through the room without any idea that the world had just shifted. She was aware of her own heartbeat, which felt strange and slow, the way a clock sounds when its spring is winding down. She had known she was not loved. She had understood that in a practical defended place in herself. But she had not known that she was nothing. That the 6 months she had spent learning his habits, managing his house, pressing herself against the edges of his life, trying to find a way in, that all of it had been so completely invisible to him that he could summarize it in a sentence to another man and not flinch. A debt settled in silk. She pressed her fingers against the marble until the cold of it moved up into her palm. Then she straightened her back, smoothed the front of her altered gown, and walked out to the side terrace. The night was warm the way Virginia summers always were, thick and green and smelling of late roses from the garden. She stood at the low stone railing and looked out over the dark of the grounds and allowed herself exactly 1 minute. 1 minute of feeling it. The humiliation. The grief of a hope she hadn't known she was still holding until it broke. The particular ache of being spoken of in the past tense by someone who was still standing in the same room. She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth, not to stop the crying. There was only 1 tear in the end, but to make a promise to herself. She said it quietly, barely a sound. No more. Not anger. Not bitterness. Just a decision, the kind a woman makes when she realizes she has been spending her resources on a door that was never going to open. She was done waiting. Done adjusting. Done measuring her worth by whether or not Nathaniel Ashford glanced at her across a dinner table. She went back inside, finished the evening with perfect composure, said goodnight to guests with a smile that revealed nothing, and went to bed while her husband was still drinking with Caldwell near the fire. She did not sleep for a long time. But when she did, she slept deeply, the way a woman sleeps when she has finally stopped holding something that was breaking her arms. The next morning, she did not go to the breakfast room. She did not wait, did not pour his coffee, did not smooth his household with careful invisible hands and hope he would notice. She put on a plain gray work dress before the house was properly awake, went down the back stairs, and walked out to the east garden. It had been Rebecca's garden once. The servants spoke of it rarely, and always with a kind of reverence that made Clara understand the space was considered untouchable. But untouchable and ruined were 2 different things, and this garden was both. 3 years of neglect had turned the beds to tangles. Weeds had grown up through what had once been lavender rose. A stone path had buckled where a tree root pushed beneath it. Everything that had been tended was now wild. Clara stood at the entrance to it with a pair of work gloves she'd borrowed from the groundskeeper's shed and looked at what was there. "All right," she said to no one, and she started pulling. The groundskeeper, an older man named Josiah, found her there an hour later. He stood at the garden gate with his hat in his hand and an expression she had seen before on the faces of servants who did not know how to address a situation they had not anticipated. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "that garden, Mr. Ashford, he never said beam, Mr. Ashford," Clara said, not looking up from the route she was working free, "has not said anything about this garden in 3 years. I am not damaging it, Josiah. I am restoring it. You may help me or not as you choose." There was a pause. "Yes, ma'am," Josiah said. He came through the gate and picked up the other pair of gloves. The garden was only the beginning. Within a week, Clara had walked the full property, and what she found there made the garden look simple. The east tenant cottages had roofs that let in water when it rained, which in July meant they let in water every afternoon. The drainage channels along the lower fields had been blocked for at minimum 2 seasons. Water was sitting in places it should have moved through, and the crop yield in those sections was already suffering. The estate ledgers, which she asked to see, with a calm directness that left the steward no polite way to refuse, showed payments going out to suppliers that did not match the supplies received, and several accounts with a name she did not yet recognize. Harrow appearing in a column labeled Miscellaneous Adjustments. She did not march any of this to Nathaniel. She was not doing this for his attention. She was doing it because the tenants were people, and the estate was in trouble, and she was present and capable and tired of being neither. She started with the roofs. She found out which contractors in Richmond had not been paid by the estate. In the last year, there were 3 of them, and she went herself with a hired carriage and her own written accounting of what was owed and what the work would cost to complete. She negotiated. She was polite and precise, and did not apologize for being a woman discussing money, which seemed to unsettle the contractors slightly, which she used to her advantage. 2 of the 3 cottages were repaired before August. She visited the tenants. She knocked on their doors in her plain gray dress and introduced herself without performance, and asked them what they needed and what they knew. The families were wary at first. They had learned not to trust the house on the hill, which had sent messages and rarely sent help. But Clara sat at their tables and drank their water and listened to what they said, and eventually they talked. They talked about Judge Silas Harrow. Harrow was a county judge, 60 years old, with land holdings that had been expanding in suspicious ways over the past decade. He owned debts, the way some men owned horses, collected them, traded them, used them. Several tenant families had received notices from Harrow's office claiming old liens on their parcels that no one had known existed. 2 families had already left rather than fight. 3 more were receiving pressure. And the name in Ashford's ledgers, Miscellaneous Adjustments, was payments that appeared to have been made from estate accounts to Harrow's land office. Someone had been paying Harrow to look away, or paying him to apply pressure. Clara was not certain yet which, but she was going to find out. It was the formal dinner in the 2nd week of August that changed things between her and Nathaniel for the first time. He had arranged it a gathering of 7 county families, the kind of social performance that Ashford Hall conducted twice a season. Clara had managed the preparation without consulting him, the same way she managed everything, and she arrived at the table composed and quiet, and intended to remain invisible in the way that apparently suited him. 3 seats to her left, a man named Fletcher, a cotton merchant from Hanover County, made a comment about the Southfield tenants that made her put down her fork. "Lazy mostly," Fletcher said with the comfortable certainty of a man who had never worked a field in his life. "They get the land, the seed, the tools. What more does a man need? The yield problems down there are management problems. The tenants simply don't apply themselves." The table made the small sounds of polite agreement that meant no one was planning to disagree. Clara looked at Fletcher. "Mr. Fletcher," she said, "the yield problems in the South Fields come from 2 blocked drainage channels that have been sending standing water into the lower acreage since at least 2814. The tenants have reported it repeatedly. The soil in those sections is waterlogged from knee-height down, which means root systems are compromised before the plant is 2 weeks old. A man could apply himself from dawn to midnight in that field and grow nothing worth eating. The problem is the land's management, not the tenants. The table went very quiet. Fletcher turned to look at her with an expression that moved through surprise and into offense. "I beg your pardon, Mrs. Ashford," she said pleasantly. "I have the drainage maps if you'd like to review them after dinner." She picked her fork back up. From the head of the table she felt Nathaniel watching her. She did not look at him. Then she heard his voice. "My wife is correct. Quiet. Definite. Not performed for the room, just stated the way a man states a fact he is not interested in debating. She has reviewed the field records thoroughly. The drainage issue has been neglected too long." Fletcher straightened in his chair and moved the conversation elsewhere with the social agility of a man accustomed to being wrong in rooms where it cost him nothing. Clara kept her eyes on her plate. She felt the warmth of it, the small stubborn hope he had said "my wife." He had defended her in front of people. That was something. That was more than 6 months of breakfast rooms and polite nothing had amounted to. She crushed it. One sentence at a dinner table did not undo 6 months. It did not undo the fireplace, and Henry Caldwell, and a debt settled in silk. It was a data point. 1. She filed it and kept moving. But that night, sitting in the garden, she had been rebuilding for 3 weeks. She heard footsteps on the path behind her and looked up to find Nathaniel standing at the garden entrance. He looked at what she had done to the place. Looked for a long time in silence. "You restored it," he said finally. "I started to," Clara said. "There's still the south bed and the stone path." "I didn't." He stopped. "I didn't give you permission." "No," she agreed. "You didn't." He looked at her. She looked back. The summer night pressed around them warm and full of cricket sound, and somewhere in the distance a horse moved in the paddock. "It was Rebecca's garden," he said. The name came out of him differently than she expected, not as a wall, but as something that cost him to say aloud. "I know," Clara said. "I didn't touch it to replace her. I touched it because it was dying." He had no answer for that. He stood there another moment, then walked back toward the house. Clara turned back to the garden wall. She did not allow herself to feel anything about the fact that he had come outside to find her. She had work to do. And she was done measuring her worth by the distance between herself and a man who had not yet learned how to look. But Nathaniel Ashford, whatever else he was not a stupid man. He began to notice her absence in the places she used to quietly fill. The breakfast room felt different without her. The dining room had no flowers. He had not thought about the flowers until they were gone, and then he thought about them more than he wanted to. He noticed that the tenant reports that came to his desk were suddenly complete and organized in a way they had not been in years, and that the signature at the bottom of the drainage correspondence was Clara's. He noticed that Elias Reed, his estate surveyor, spent 3 mornings a week walking the south fields with Clara and talking to her the way a man talks to someone whose opinion he respects. Elias was young and decent and educated, and he laughed easily, and Clara laughed back at something Elias said one morning outside the East Cottage, and Nathaniel, watching from the stable yard across the lane, felt something move through his chest that he had not felt in 3 years. He recognized it immediately. He wished he didn't. He had wasted something. He had been handed something real, and he had looked straight through it for 6 months, and called it an arrangement, and gone back to his study and his grief. And now a decent young man was making his wife laugh in a field, and Nathaniel Ashford was standing in his own stable yard, feeling the precise and specific pain of a man who has understood too late what he was holding. He went back inside. He sat at his desk. He looked at Rebecca's portrait on the wall. She had insisted on hanging it herself the summer before she got sick, and for the first time in 3 years, he did not feel only grief when he looked at it. He felt something else. Something that felt uncomfortably like accountability. He had loved Rebecca. He had loved her completely, and he had watched her die, and he had decided somewhere in the wreckage of that the safe thing was to never let anything reach him again. Clara had been safe because he had made sure of it. He had kept her at a careful distance, the way a man keeps a lamp turned low, present enough for function, never bright enough to burn. He had not considered what it cost her to live in that dimness. He was beginning to. Outside through the study window, he could hear Clara's voice giving instructions to Josiah about the stone path. Nathaniel Ashford pressed his hand flat against his desk and stayed very still. He had made a mistake, a long, deliberate, cowardly mistake. The question, the one he did not yet know how to answer, was whether a man like him could find his way back from something like that, or whether he had already waited too long. The stone path in the east garden was still buckled in 3 places when Clara woke before sunrise on a Tuesday in early August and decided she was done waiting for the groundskeeper's schedule to accommodate it. She went out herself with a pry bar she had borrowed from the tool shed and started lifting the displaced stones one by one. Josiah found her there 20 minutes later and stood at the garden gate with his arms crossed and an expression that had moved past surprise into something closer to quiet admiration, though he would never have said so. "You're going to pull your back," he said. "Then I'll pull it," Clara said, working the bar under the edge of a stone. "Hand me that flat piece, would you, the gray one?" Josiah sighed, set down his hat on the wall, and came to help. That was the thing about Clara Whitmore Ashford, that people were beginning to notice. She did not ask for sympathy, and she did not perform suffering. She simply worked. She showed up before the house was awake, and she stayed out past the comfortable hour, and she treated the problem in front of her as a problem to be solved rather than a condition to be endured. The servants had started watching her the way people watch something they don't quite have a word for yet. The tenants had already found their word. They called her the Ashford woman, but they said it the way you say something that's earned respect, not dismissively, but with weight behind it. By the second week of August, Clara had done 3 things that no one at Ashford Hall had managed in 3 years. She had repaired 2 of the east cottages. She had cleared the primary blockage in the south drainage channel and commissioned a local engineer to assess the secondary one. And she had written a careful documented letter to the county land office requesting a full accounting of the liens Harrow's office had placed on tenant parcels, a letter she sent without asking Nathaniel and without signing his name. She signed her own. She was sitting at the small writing desk in the room she had quietly claimed as her own, a spare room off the east hall. Nothing grand, but it caught the morning light when the letter came back. Not from the land office. From Harrow himself. She broke the seal and read it twice. It was polite. It was, in fact, aggressively polite, the way certain men are polite when they want you to understand the threat without being able to quote it back to them later. Judge Silas Harrow wrote that he had received her inquiry with interest, that he had a great respect for the Ashford family and its long history in the county, and that he hoped Mrs. Ashford understood that questions of legal liens were complex matters best left to those with proper training in such affairs. He looked forward. He wrote to discussing any concerns she had through the appropriate channels, meaning she understood immediately through Nathaniel over Harrow's desk, where Harrow had the advantage. Clara set the letter on the desk, pressed her fingers flat against the surface, and thought. Then she picked up her pen and wrote back. She thanked him for his prompt response. She agreed that liens were complex. She noted that she had, in reviewing the Ashford estate ledgers, found several payments made from estate accounts to a landholding company registered to his family's name, and that she was certain there was a perfectly reasonable explanation, and that she would be grateful if he could provide it in writing at his earliest convenience, since she was preparing a full accounting of the estate's financial position for the family's legal representative in Richmond. She did not have a legal representative in Richmond. Not yet. But she was going to get one. She sent the letter before noon. By evening, she had heard through Josiah, who had heard from the stable hand, who had heard from the delivery driver, who serviced both Ashford Hall and 3 other properties in the county, that Judge Harrow had been in a foul temper all afternoon. Clara allowed herself a small private satisfaction. Then she went back to the drainage maps. It was Elias Reed who had given her the maps. How was 29? The estate surveyor hired 2 years ago when Nathaniel had decided the property lines needed a formal assessment. He was lanky and quietly serious, and wore his hair pushed back from his forehead in a way that made him look perpetually as though he'd just come in from the wind. He had a habit of thinking carefully before he spoke, which Clara had come to appreciate enormously after 6 months of a husband who either said nothing at all or said exactly the wrong thing with perfect composure. "The secondary blockage is here," Elias said one morning, spreading the map on the low wall near the south field. He pointed to a section where two channels converged. And here, the water's been backing up since at least the spring before last, maybe longer. Nobody reported it because nobody was asked, Clara said. Right. He looked at her. You're asking. I'm asking, she agreed. He told her everything he knew about the land, which was considerable, and she told him what she had found in the ledgers, and between the two of them, they began to assemble a picture of Ashford Estate that was considerably more complicated and considerably more troubled than its polished exterior suggested. Nathaniel watched these conversations from a distance and felt something he would not name. It wasn't suspicion of Clara's intentions. Whatever else he had failed her in, he was not so far gone as to believe she was anything but honest. It wasn't exactly suspicion of Elias, who was decent to his bones. It was something uglier and more personal than suspicion, which was why he refused to examine it directly. He rode the North Fields on a Thursday morning when he knew Clara and Elias would be at the south drainage site. He came back 2 hours later than he'd planned. He passed the south field on his way back to the stable and saw them standing at the channel, and Elias was saying something, and Clara was laughing. He rode past without stopping. That evening at dinner, they still ate together 3 times a week, a habit that had not changed, even though everything else had. He found himself watching her hands when she reached for the salt. She had a small cut on her right palm from the garden work. It was healing. He hadn't known about it. He hadn't known about it because she had stopped telling him things. She had stopped the careful conversational offerings she used to bring to the table, like someone leaving food at the edge of a bird feeder, hoping something would come close enough to take it. He had refused every one of them without realizing he was refusing. Now she sat across from him and talked to Mrs. Monroe, his aunt, who came to dinner on Thursdays, about the Drainage Commission and the engineer's timeline and the price of tile versus stone for the channel lining. She was animated in a way he had never seen at this table. She laughed twice. She challenged his aunt on some point about the South counties, and his aunt challenged her back, and neither of them looked to him for permission or approval. He ate his meal and said almost nothing, and thought about what it meant that the room felt more alive than it had in 3 years, and that he had nothing to do with it. After dinner, Mrs. Monroe found him in the hallway. Abigail Monroe was 61, sharp-eyed, and had been managing his moods since he was 8 years old, with a directness that no one else in his life had ever matched. "Nathaniel," she said. "Aunt Abigail. That girl is saving your estate." "Clara is." "Don't tell me what she is," his aunt said. "I know what she is. I'm asking whether you know yet." He looked at her. "She's been working those fields and those ledgers and those tenant roofs since the day after your midsummer dinner," Mrs. Monroe said. "And before you say she is doing it because she has nothing else to do, I want you to think carefully about what it cost her to be doing it at all, given what you said that night." The pause between them was very still. "You heard," he said. "Josiah heard. The footman heard. The whole east side of that room heard, Nathaniel, because you said it at a normal volume, and men like Caldwell have a carrying laugh." She looked at him steadily. "A debt settled in silk. That is what you called your wife to a room full of people." He said nothing because there was nothing to say that wouldn't make it worse. "She cried," his aunt said. "Once on the terrace. I was coming in from the garden, and I saw her from the path, and she pressed her hand to her mouth, and she stood very straight, and she cried once, and then she stopped. And she has not cried since that I have seen. She went to work instead." Mrs. Monroe straightened her shawl. "I find that a great deal more alarming than crying, Nathaniel. I always have." She went back to the sitting room. Nathaniel stood in the hallway for a long time. He thought about Clara on the terrace. He thought about a woman who had spent 6 months trying to find a way into a house where every door was quietly closed against her, and then had simply decided to build something of her own instead. He thought about Elias Reed's easy laughter and Clara's face when she talked about field drainage with the animation of a person who had finally found a room where they were allowed to take up space. He went to his study. He sat at his desk. He looked at Rebecca's portrait and felt for the first time something that was not grief, but its practical consequence, the understanding that he had taken the love he'd lost and used it as a reason to refuse everything that came after. He had not been protecting Clara from the pain of his grief. He had been protecting himself. and she had paid the price for it quietly, with her hands in the dirt, and her name on letters to a county judge, while her husband sat in his study and called it protection. He opened the desk drawer and looked at nothing for a moment. Then he closed it again, stood up, and went to find her. She was in the east garden, which was what she did in the late evenings, now moved through the recovered beds in the low summer dark, checking what was growing, pulling the occasional intruder weed, talking sometimes to Josiah if he was still about. The roses she'd replanted along the south wall were opening. The lavender was in and fragrant. The stone path ran straight and level now. Nathaniel stood at the garden entrance for a moment before she heard him. When she turned, her expression was neutral. Not cold, just defended, calibrated. The face of a woman who had learned not to let herself expect anything. That more than anything else his aunt had said went into him like a blade. "The engineer's report," he said, because he had to start somewhere. "I read it this afternoon. The secondary drainage work, it's a substantial project." "It is," Clara said. "But it's necessary. The south yield will improve by at least a third once the water moves properly." "I know." He paused. "I should have caught it sooner." She looked at him. "Yes," she said simply. "You should have." No softening, no reassurance, just the truth, which was what he deserved. He stayed at the garden entrance, not coming in. That felt right, like the garden was hers in a way the rest of the house was not, and he did not have permission to simply walk into it. "Harrow," he said. "You wrote to his office." "I did. He came to see me today." Clara went still. Nathaniel's jaw tightened slightly. "He came to the study. Told me he was concerned about some confusion regarding the estate accounts. Said that you had written him a letter that suggested some misunderstanding that he would be glad to clear up man to man if I preferred." He paused. He said it the way men say things when they believe the woman who started the conversation will be quietly removed from it. Clara set down the small pruning tool she'd been holding. Her voice was even. "And what did you say?" "I told him the estate accounts were my wife's area of management. I told him any correspondence she had initiated was authorized. And I told him that if there were irregularities in the payments he had received from this estate, I expected a full written accounting of them within 2 weeks. Clara looked at him. "He didn't like that," Nathaniel added. "No," Clara said. "I imagine he didn't." A beat. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. It's my estate. Whatever he's been taking from it comes out of the same place." She nodded. She picked her pruning tool back up. She was going to go back to the roses. He could see it, the careful return to her own work, the polite dismissal, the management of distance. "Clara." She stopped. I didn't know what he was going to say until he said it. "I know this house has been difficult. I know I've been—" He stopped, started again. "I know you've been working to hold things together here that I should have been holding myself. I see that now." She was quiet for a moment. "Nathaniel," she said finally, and her voice was careful and very honest. "Seeing it now is not the same as not having missed it for 6 months." "No," he said. "It isn't." "I am glad you see it," she said. "I am." And there was something genuine in that, not warmth exactly, but fairness. She was a fair woman. He was beginning to understand how much that had cost her. "But I am not the same woman who poured your coffee every morning and waited for you to notice. I am not waiting anymore." "I know," he said. "I'm not certain you do," she said gently. "But I think you're beginning to." She went back to the roses. He walked back to the house. He sat in his study until well past midnight, not working, just sitting with the particular company of a man who has realized that accountability and apology are not the same thing, and that the second one, without the long proof of the first, means almost nothing to a woman who has already rebuilt herself without him. The next morning, there was a development that changed everything. It came in the form of 3 women from the County Church Society who arrived at Ashford Hall just before noon in a shared carriage and asked to speak with Clara. Their faces were arranged in the particular expression of women who are delivering something unpleasant under the social cover of concern. Their leader was a Mrs. Patience Holt, 60, with a spine like a rifle barrel and a smile that never reached her eyes. She had been Harrow's family friend for 30 years. Clara received them in the parlor. "We have heard some troubling things," Mrs. Holt began, "about the nature of your work here, the tenant visits, the correspondence with Mr. Reed particularly." Clara set her teacup down. "What kind of troubling things?" "You have been spending considerable time alone with a young man who is not your husband," Mrs. Holt said with the delicacy of a woman dropping something hard on purpose. "People are talking, Mrs. Ashford. It reflects poorly on you, on Mr. Ashford, and on this household." The room was very still. Clara looked at Mrs. Holt with an expression that was so composed it took a moment to register as refusal. "Mr. Reed is the estate surveyor," Clara said. "I have been reviewing drainage maps and field assessments with him because the south acreage is flooding and the tenants cannot grow food in standing water. I have done this in full view of the groundskeeper, the field workers, and 3 tenant families. If the people talking about it would like to come and review the drainage data themselves, I would be glad to arrange it." Mrs. Holt shifted. "That is not quite the point. Then perhaps you could tell me what the point is," Clara said pleasantly. Mrs. Holt looked at her. Clara looked back. "Mrs. Ashford." Mrs. Holt tried again. "It would perhaps be better if your husband managed these estate matters directly and you focused on the household," Clara said. "Yes, I understand what you're suggesting." She stood. She was not tall, but she had a way of taking up space that the room registered. "I manage this household, Mrs. Holt. I also manage the estate accounts, the tenant correspondence, and the drainage commission, because those things needed managing, and I am capable of managing them. My husband is aware of everything I do. If there is a specific allegation of impropriety you wish to make, I would suggest making it clearly so it can be clearly answered. But if you are here to tell me that a woman working to protect workers and land is inappropriate, then I'm afraid we are going to have to disagree." The visit ended shortly after. When the carriage had gone, Josiah appeared at the parlor door. His expression was torn between alarm and something that was unmistakably pride. "Mrs. Ashford," he said. "Mr. Ashford heard that. He was in the hallway." Clara straightened the cushions on the chair where Mrs. Holt had been sitting. "Good," she said quietly. Nathaniel said nothing to her about it that afternoon. But at dinner, he looked at her across the table, with something in his expression that she did not immediately recognize, because she had not seen it before, and it took her a moment to identify it. It was not gratitude. It was not guilt. It was not the careful, managed acknowledgement he had been offering since the night in the garden. It was simply recognition. He was finally seeing her, not as the debt, not as the arrangement, not as the quiet, careful presence he had chosen not to engage. He was seeing Clara, the woman who had taken a ruined garden and rebuilt it with her bare hands, who had stared down a county judge and a church society and 3 flooding fields, and had not once asked permission to be capable. Clara picked up her fork. She did not let herself feel too much about that look. She had learned her lesson. Hope was expensive, and she was budgeting carefully now. But she felt it anyway, a small, stubborn ember of it low in her chest. She told it firmly to behave. It did not entirely listen. The 2 weeks Nathaniel had given Harrow for a written accounting came and went without a letter. What arrived instead on a Wednesday morning in the 3rd week of August was a notice from the county court. Clara read it standing at her writing desk, and she read it twice, and then she set it down with the particular stillness of a woman absorbing a blow she had been halfway expecting. Harrow had filed a formal petition. He was challenging Ashford ownership of the disputed south parcels, 38 acres that bordered his own land, on the grounds of an allegedly unpaid debt from a land transaction conducted by Nathaniel's father in 1801. The petition cited documents Clara had never seen signed by a notary. She did not recognize, referencing an agreement that appeared nowhere in the Ashford estate records she had spent the last 6 weeks reviewing. She picked the notice back up, read it a 3rd time. Then she went and knocked on the door of Nathaniel's study. He opened it himself, which was unusual. He generally let the staff manage doors. He took one look at her face and stepped back to let her in without a word. She put the notice on his desk. She stood back and let him read it. She watched his expression move through several things, in fast succession: confusion, then recognition, then a jaw tightening that she had come to understand meant he was managing anger rather than displaying it. "These documents," he said. "I've never seen them." "Neither have I. And I have been through every file in this estate going back to 1798. "Then they don't exist. Or they've been manufactured." "That's what I believe," Clara said. "But belief and proof are two different things in a county court, and Harrow has been a county judge for 20 years. He knows every procedure and every delay and every way to make a legitimate challenge look illegitimate and an illegitimate one look sound." Nathaniel set the notice down. He looked at her. "What do you need?" It was such a simple question, such a direct and uncomplicated offering. She had spent 6 months trying to reach this man, and he had spent 6 months looking through her, and now he was standing on the other side of his desk asking what she needed, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. She did not let herself spend time on that. There wasn't time. "I need access to your father's original land records," she said. "The ones he kept personally, not the estate copies. If the agreement Harrow is citing was ever real, there would be correspondence about it. Letters, notes, something. And if it was manufactured, there will be inconsistencies in the document dating that a careful reading will find." "They're in the attic storage," Nathaniel said. "I'll have Josiah bring them down this morning." "All of them." "All of them," he agreed. She turned to go. "Clara." She stopped. "I should have dealt with Harrow 6 months ago," he said. "I knew about the lien pressure on the tenants. I thought I told myself it wasn't urgent enough to warrant a confrontation." She turned back. She looked at him very directly. "Why didn't you?" "Because confronting Harrow would have required me to be fully present in this estate's affairs," he said, "and I was not fully present in anything." The honesty of it was so unexpected that she didn't have an immediate answer. She stood there for a moment with a response half-formed, and then let it go. "The records," she said instead. "This morning." "This morning," he agreed. She went back to her desk. Her hands were steady. Her mind was already moving through documents and timelines and the particular logic of paper trails, which was a thing she had discovered. She was good at finding the place where numbers didn't add up and following the thread from there. But underneath the steadiness, there was something else moving too. Something she was going to have to pay attention to eventually. She pushed it aside and went to work. The boxes from the attic arrived in 3 loads. Josiah stacked them against the wall of her workroom with the look of a man who had carried heavy things all his life and was not complaining but wanted it noted. "Thank you, Josiah," she said. "There's one more," he said. "Smaller. From the music room." Clara looked up from the first box. "The music room. Mr. Ashford said to bring everything from the storage side of it. The shelves behind the piano." Josiah set a smaller wooden box on the table. "This was behind the others. Don't think it's estate records, but he said everything." Clara looked at the small box. It had a brass clasp, the kind with a small lock that was more decorative than functional. It was not locked. The clasp had simply been turned to keep it closed. She opened the lid. Inside, there was a book bound in dark green cloth, the kind of journal a woman of some means would have purchased in a Richmond shop. And beneath it, a sealed envelope with a name written on the front in a hand she did not know. Nathaniel. She sat back. She understood immediately what she was holding. The green journal. The sealed letter. The room it had come from, the room that had been closed for 3 years. The name on every pair of lips in this house, spoken only in absence and grief. She picked up the journal and held it for a moment without opening it. She should bring it to Nathaniel. Unopened. That was the right thing. This was not hers. She set it down. She stood up. She was going to take it to the study. Then she sat back down. She was not sure why. Later she would think it was something about the way the book felt in her hands, not like a private thing being kept from her, but like a thing that had been waiting to be found by whoever was going to do something about it. Rebecca had put it on a shelf. She had sealed the letter and written his name on it. She had not destroyed either one. Clara opened the journal to the last pages. She read slowly. Her hands were very steady. Her chest was not. Rebecca Ashford had been dying through the winter of 1813, and she had known it, and she had written through it with a clarity that made Clara's throat tighten. Not self-pity clarity. The observations of a woman who had decided to use her remaining time telling the truth. She wrote about loving Nathaniel. She wrote about his gifts, his steadiness, his intelligence, the way he could make a person feel when he chose to, that they were the only thing worth attending to in any room. She wrote about watching those gifts turn inward as she got sicker, watching him go rigid with grief before she was even gone, watching him choose distance because presence cost him too much. He sat with me every day until January. Rebecca had written. And then he stopped coming, and I understood that he was not abandoning me. I was trying to survive me. A man who loves that completely does not know how to stand at a bed and watch. He knows how to fix things, and he could not fix this. And so he disappeared into the estate accounts and the field work. And I let him because I loved him and I knew him. And some people love in ways that can hold suffering. And some people love in ways that cannot. And neither kind is wrong. Clara stopped. Read that again. Neither kind is wrong. She kept reading. The last entry was dated 3 weeks before Rebecca died. It was short. I have written him a letter. I have asked Margaret to put it with my journal on the music room shelf where he will find it when he is ready. I do not know when that will be. But I know Nathaniel, and I know that whatever woman he finds after me, and he will eventually, because his life is long and he is better than he believes, she will be the one who finds it. Not him. He would have to go into that room to find it, and he is not going into that room. Not for years. So I am leaving it for her. Whoever she is. I hope she is strong. I hope she is patient. I hope she knows what she has even when he doesn't know how to show it. Clara closed the journal. She sat very still for a long time. Then she picked up the sealed letter addressed to Nathaniel, picked up the journal, and walked down the hall to the study. He was at his desk when she came in. He looked up and saw her face, and stood immediately the way a man stands when he registers that whatever is coming is serious. She set the journal on his desk first, then the letter. She watched him look at the handwriting on the envelope. Watched his face change, not dramatically, not the way grief sometimes performs itself, but in the small private way of a man who has been struck somewhere internal. Where? He said, and his voice was not quite steady. The music room storage, with the estate boxes. He did not reach for either one immediately. He stood looking at them the way a person stands at the edge of something they know will change them. She left it for you, Clara said. The letter. You should read it. He looked up at her. Did you read the journal? A pause. She was not going to lie to him. The last pages, yes. Then you know? I know she loved you, Clara said. I know she understood you better than you understood yourself. And I know she forgave you for the sick room before you had a chance to ask. Something moved through his face, fast and then controlled. He pressed his hand flat on the desk. I stopped going, he said. In January. It was getting worse and I could not. He stopped. I told myself she needed rest, that my presence distressed her, that it was better. I know, Clara said. She knew too. I left her alone to die, he said, and the words came out raw in a way that told her they had been living in him for 3 years without ever being said aloud. I could not watch it, and so I left, and she died in that room without me in it, and there is not a day. Nathaniel. Her voice was quiet but firm. Read the letter. He picked it up. He broke the seal. His hands, she noticed, were not entirely steady. She stepped back. She was going to give him the room. Don't go, he said without looking up from the page. Please. She stayed. She stood by the window and looked out at the garden while he read. She gave him privacy and presence the way Rebecca, she thought, had probably learned to do, being in the room, without requiring the room to perform around her. The silence lasted a long time. When she heard him exhale a long, slow breath that sounded like something being set down after being carried too long, she turned. I was not crying. He was the kind of man who didn't probably, or couldn't, or had decided years ago that he wouldn't. But his face was open in a way she had never seen it, undone in the way that honest grief undoes things, scraping away the careful management and leaving just the person underneath. He set the letter on the desk. She said, he started, then stopped. She said she was not angry at me for leaving. She said she knew why. She said she spent her last weeks hoping I would find someone to love again, and that she hoped I would not ruin it by being afraid. Clara looked at him. She said, he continued, and his voice was lower now, that if I was reading this letter, it probably meant I had already ruined it at least halfway, and that I should stop before I finished the job. Despite everything, the grief in the room, the weight of the last 3 years, the weight of the last 6 months. Clara felt something move through her that was almost a laugh. She pressed it down. She knew you, Clara said. She knew me. He looked at the letter. I have spent 3 years telling myself that keeping everyone at a distance was grief, that it was loyalty, that it was protection, Clara said quietly. He looked up. I know, she said. I thought perhaps that was what it was in the beginning, that you were protecting me from something. I was protecting myself, he said, from the possibility of losing again. He met her eyes directly with the kind of honesty that costs something. I know that doesn't excuse what I said at the dinner. I know it doesn't excuse 6 months of making you feel like nothing in your own house. Knowing why a wound was made doesn't undo the wound. The room was very quiet. Clara looked at her husband, this difficult, frozen, slowly thawing man, and felt the full, complicated weight of what was happening. This was the conversation she had wanted 6 months ago. This was the door she had pressed her hands against and found locked. It was open now, and she was not the same woman who had knocked. No, she said. It doesn't undo it. She paused. But it changes what I do with it. He looked at her carefully. What does that mean? It means I am not going to pretend the last 6 months didn't happen, she said. And I am not going to fall into your arms because you had a painful afternoon and told me the truth. That is not how trust is rebuilt. She held his gaze. But I am willing to see what comes next, if you are. I am, he said, immediately. No calculation, no composure. Just the plain statement of a man who meant it. Then there is one thing I need from you first, Clara said. Not eventually, now. Name it. Harrow is filing his petition in 2 weeks at the county assembly, she said. He is going to stand in front of every family in this county and challenge this estate, and by extension, challenge every piece of work I have done here, because he has understood correctly that I am the one who found him out. He is going to attack my reputation, my competence, and my right to have done any of it. She paused. I need you to stand beside me in that room. Not in front of me, not behind me, beside me. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. I will be there, he said. I need you to say it publicly, she said. Not to defend me the way a man defends property. Beside me as a partner. Whatever I say, you support it. Whatever evidence I present you, stand behind it. Clara, he said, and his voice was very steady, now the steadiness of a man who has made a decision and means to keep it. I will be beside you. She nodded once. She picked up Rebecca's journal from his desk. I'll return this to you tonight, she said. You should read all of it, not just the letter. She walked to the door. Clara. She turned. Nathaniel looked at her from across the room, across the desk, and the letter, and 3 years of ghost, and 6 months of locked doors, and said simply, Thank you for finding it. She held the journal against her chest. She left it to be found, Clara said. I was just the one who showed up. She went back to her workroom and sat down at the table full of estate records and land documents and evidence of Harrow's fraud. She sat there for a full minute doing nothing, which was unusual for her. Then she pressed the back of her hand briefly to her mouth, not to stop crying because she was not crying, not quite, and picked up her pen. She had 2 weeks, and Judge Silas Harrow had spent 20 years building his little empire of pressure and debt and manufactured documents, and he had made one serious mistake. He had assumed that the woman at Ashford Hall was the same woman who had stood behind a marble column at a midsummer dinner and quietly wept. She was not. She had never been that woman, not really. She had only been a woman waiting to find out who she was when someone finally gave her room enough to be it. Now she had the room. Now Harrow was going to find out what she'd built in it. The 2 weeks before the county assembly were the busiest of Clara's life. She worked from before sunrise until the candles burned low, and she did not complain about it, and she did not ask for acknowledgement because she had stopped doing things in order to be noticed. She was doing this because it needed doing, and because she was the one who could do it, and those two reasons were enough. The evidence she was building was careful and layered. She had the estate ledgers going back 15 years, cross-referenced against Harrow's land office records, which were public documents that anyone could request from the county clerk, and which no one apparently had bothered to request until now. She had the testimony of 4 tenant families' written statements signed with dates and specific amounts describing the pressure Harrow's men had applied and the money that had changed hands under threat of lien enforcement. She had the original land survey from 1803, conducted by a surveyor who was still alive and still practicing in Richmond, and who, when Elias Reed paid him a visit on Clara's behalf, confirmed that the parcel boundaries Harrow was now disputing had been settled and agreed upon by all parties at the time, including Harrow's own predecessor in the land office. And she had the manufactured document itself, the alleged debt agreement from 1801 that formed the basis of Harrow's petition. She had spent 4 days with it, reading it against every other document produced by the same notary office in that period, and she had found what she was looking for on the morning of the 5th day: the notary's seal. The seal used on Harrow's document was a design that had not been adopted by that office until 1809. The document purported to be from 1801, 8 years off. The kind of error that a man in a hurry makes when he is manufacturing evidence and does not think a woman in a plantation house is going to be precise enough to catch it. When she brought this to Nathaniel, she set the documents side by side on his desk without a word and let him look. He looked for a long time. "He forged it," Nathaniel said. "He forged it," Clara agreed. Nathaniel leaned back. Something moved through his face, not satisfaction exactly, more like the particular calm of a man who has decided what he is going to do and is no longer uncertain about it. "I want to be in the room when you present this," he said. "I know," Clara said. "That was the agreement. I mean, I want to be prepared," he said. "Tell me everything, all of it. Every document, every witness, every number. I want to know it as well as you do." She looked at him. He was serious. Not performing seriousness, actually serious in the way of a man who understands that showing up is not the same as being useful and who wants to be useful. "That will take most of tonight," she said. "Then we start now," he said. They worked until past midnight at his study table, Clara explaining, Nathaniel asking questions that were sharper than she expected, both of them going back and forth over the same documents until they both knew the argument cold. Somewhere around 10 o'clock. Mrs. Monroe appeared in the doorway, looked at the two of them, bent over the same papers under the same lamplight, and went away again without saying a word. But Clara heard her in the hallway, and she thought, though she could not be certain, that the sound she heard was a quiet exhale of relief. Nathaniel brought her a cup of coffee at 11 without being asked. He set it at her elbow and went back to the ledger he was reviewing without making anything of it. Clara looked at the cup. She looked at his profile. She picked up the coffee and kept working. She did not make anything of it either, but she noted it the way she noted everything, carefully, without conclusion, filed away for later consideration. The night before the county assembly, Harrow made his move. He had been quiet for 10 days, which Clara had not trusted for a moment. Quiet men with something to lose were not inactive men. They were men who were choosing their angle. His angle arrived in the form of a letter delivered to 3 of the most prominent families in the county, the Caldwells, the Fletchers, and the Holts, containing what he described as a concerned report about the conduct of Mrs. Nathaniel Ashford. The letter cited her unsupervised work with Elias Reed. It cited her quote-unquote interference in legal matters beyond her understanding. It described her as a woman of uncertain character, from a family of demonstrated financial irresponsibility, who had married above her station and was now overreaching in ways that reflected poorly on the Ashford name and on the county's standards of propriety. He sent copies to 4 other households as well. By morning, Clara knew about every copy. The county's information moved faster than its roads always had. She was standing in the kitchen when Josiah brought her the last report of the letter's circulation, and she listened to everything he said, and when he was done, she thanked him and poured herself another cup of coffee and stood at the kitchen table thinking. The letter was Harrow's panic. She recognized it immediately. This was not strategy. This was a man trying to burn the ground around her before she could stand on it in public. He had seen the evidence requests. He had understood that she had found something. He was trying to make the room distrust her before she had a chance to speak. The question was whether it would work. Nathaniel came in while she was still thinking. He had clearly already heard his jaw was tight, and his eyes had the quality of a man holding something in that would rather come out. "I've seen it," Clara said before he could speak. "He sent it to Caldwell," Nathaniel said. "Henry Caldwell, who has known me since we were 12 years old, received a letter calling my wife a woman of uncertain character." "I know. I want to—" "Nathaniel." Her voice was even. "If you ride to Harrow's house today, you give him exactly what he wants. A scene. A confrontation that can be described as the Ashfords acting out of emotion rather than evidence. The assembly is tomorrow. We answer him tomorrow in the room with the documents." She met his eyes. "Can you hold it one more day?" His jaw worked. "Yes," he said finally. "But it costs me." "I know it does," she said. "Thank you." Something passed between them in that moment. Not a dramatic thing, not a declaration. Just the recognition that they were actually in this together. That the word we had stopped being theoretical. Elias Reed came to Ash Hall that afternoon. He had also seen the letter. He stood in the front hallway with his hat in his hands and his honest, uncomplicated face carrying the expression of a man who is angry on someone else's behalf. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, "I want you to know that if it would help, I am prepared to provide a full accounting of every meeting we have had. Dates, locations, what was discussed, who else was present. I will give it to anyone in that county who wants to read it." Clara looked at him. "That is very decent of you, Mr. Reed." "It's the truth," he said simply. "I know it is." She paused. "I'll take the written accounting. It may be useful tomorrow." He nodded. He was about to go, and then he stopped. "Mrs. Ashford, can I say something that isn't my business?" "You've been saying things that weren't your business for 2 months," she said. "It hasn't slowed you down yet." The corner of his mouth moved. "Whatever happens in that room tomorrow, whether the evidence lands the way it should, or whether Harrow manages to muddy it, you have changed things here. The tenants know it. The Southfields are already draining better. The families who were afraid to speak are speaking. That happened because of you. Not the estate. You." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Thank you, Mr. Reed," she said. He put his hat back on and went. Nathaniel, who had been in the hallway, said nothing. But when Clara turned, he was looking at the closed door with an expression she had come to recognize, the expression of a man accounting for his own failures, by measuring them against the testimony of other people who had actually paid attention. She did not say anything to him about it. She went to bed early and slept surprisingly well. The county assembly hall in Richmond was full the next morning. Clara had not expected it to be quite so full. Harrow's letter had done its work. Everyone wanted to see how this would resolve, which meant that the room that would witness whatever happened was going to be the largest possible audience, which was either a disaster or an opportunity, depending entirely on how the evidence landed. She sat beside Nathaniel at the front table. She had chosen her dress with care, not the blue silk of the midsummer dinner. Nothing that recalled that night. A deep green wool plain at the neck, good quality, but not ostentatious. The dress of a woman who was not performing wealth she didn't have, and not apologizing for what she did. Harrow was already there when they arrived. He was 60 years old, and carried his authority the way men do when they have held it so long they've stopped being aware of it as a thing they have to earn. He looked at Clara when she came in, and his expression was the expression of a man who has looked at many women and found them manageable. That look, more than anything else in the room, settled something in Clara's chest. She sat down. She organized her documents. She was ready. The assembly's presiding officer, a ruddy-faced man named Baxter, who had the air of someone who had not anticipated his Thursday being this complicated, called the session to order and gave Harrow the floor first as the petitioning party. Harrow was good. She had to grant him that. He was practiced and calm, and he framed his petition in the language of order and precedent and county stability, as though he were doing everyone a favor by raising these questions. He cited the 1801 document. He cited the unpaid debt. He described the disputed parcels with the fluency of someone who had been rehearsing this for weeks. And then, almost as a footnote, delivered with a regretful tone that Clara recognized as calculated, he mentioned that the estate's current management had been perhaps somewhat irregular. That questions had been raised about the judgment of those conducting certain negotiations on the estate's behalf. That he hoped the assembly would keep in mind the full picture. He did not say her name. He didn't need to. Every person in the room knew who he meant. Clara felt Nathaniel's hand tighten on the table beside her. He did not reach for her hand, but she felt the intention of it. When Baxter gave them the floor, Nathaniel stood first. The room was immediately attentive in the way rooms are when a man who has said very little suddenly stands up. Nathaniel had a quality of presence that did not need volume. He simply occupied space with a solidity that made people pay attention. "My name is Nathaniel Ashford," he said with the dry simplicity of a man who was aware that everyone in the room knew exactly who he was. "I have managed this estate and my family's obligations in this county for 12 years. I have never defaulted on a legitimate debt. I have never failed to honor a documented agreement. And I have never had cause until this month to question the integrity of the county land office." He paused. "My wife will present the evidence regarding Judge Harrow's petition. I have reviewed it in full. I stand behind every word of it." He sat down. He did not look at Harrow. He looked at Clara. She stood. The room shifted, not hostile, but uncertain in the way rooms are when something unexpected is asked of them. She did not begin with the seal. She began with the tenants. She named them. All 4 families by name with dates and amounts. She read from their signed statements in a voice that was steady and carried clearly and did not apologize for itself. She described the pressure, the visits from Harrow's men, the liens on parcels that the families had worked and owned for years, the money paid under duress because the alternative was losing everything. She heard the room changing as she read. The uncertain quality becoming something else, the particular silence of people who are realizing they are hearing something true. Then she presented the ledgers. The payments from Ashford estate accounts to Harrow's landholding company labeled miscellaneous adjustments going back 4 years. She explained what they were and what they were not. They were not legitimate fees because she had found no corresponding services rendered, no documentation, no invoices. They were payments to a man who was applying pressure that those payments were meant to relieve, which made them extortion regardless of what they were called in a ledger. Harrow stood up. "Madam, those payments were—" "Mr. Harrow," Baxter said, "you'll have the floor when Mrs. Ashford is finished." Harrow sat. His face was controlled, but she had rattled him. She could see it. Then she put the 1801 document on this table and explained the seal. She was precise. She did not editorialize. She simply laid out the facts, the design, the adoption date, the 8-year discrepancy, with the methodical clarity of a woman who had spent her life managing accounts and details, and the careful work of keeping things from falling apart. The kind of work that men in rooms like this one had always been too comfortable to notice. "The document Judge Harrow is presenting as the basis for his petition against Ashford land," she said, "was made after the date it claims to bear. I do not know who made it. I know it was not made in 1801. The seal proves that. And I have brought the original seal records from the notary office for any member of this assembly who would like to verify it themselves." She set the seal records on the table. The room was very quiet. Harrow stood again. This time Baxter did not stop him, because it was his right, and because the room needed to hear what he would say. What he said was less than Clara had expected. He questioned her expertise. He questioned her authority to interpret legal documents. He made one more glancing reference to the irregular nature of her involvement in estate affairs. From 3 rows back, Mrs. Munro's voice came clearly through the hall. "Mrs. Ashford is a woman who has spent 2 months saving an estate. Her husband left unattended. I would recommend questioning her competence only if you are prepared to explain your own." The room erupted not into chaos, but into the kind of layered noise that means a crowd has found its collective opinion. Baxter called for quiet. He got it eventually. He looked at the documents. He looked at Harrow. He looked at Clara. I am going to request a formal review of the 1801 document by the Richmond Land Office, he said. In the interim, the petition is suspended. Judge Harrow, I suggest you prepare a full accounting of the estate payments described in these ledgers. We will reconvene in 30 days. It was not a complete victory. It was the beginning of one. Clara stood at the table, while the room began to move around her, and she felt the strange weightlessness of having done the thing she set out to do. Not perfectly, not finally, but solidly enough that it couldn't be undone. Nathaniel was beside her, literally beside her shoulder to shoulder, while people approached and spoke and moved around them. A man named Griggs, a tobacco farmer from the south of the county, who had been at the table with Harrow 2 months ago and said nothing, stopped in front of Clara and took off his hat. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, "that was a fine piece of work." "Thank you, Mr. Griggs," she said. He put his hat back on and walked out. Elias Reed appeared and shook Clara's hand, and then Nathaniel's, and said, "Well done, both of you," without any fuss, the way decent people do things. When the room had mostly cleared, Harrow walked past them toward the door. He did not stop. He did not speak. But he looked at Clara once briefly, and in that look was something she recognized, not respect exactly. More like the moment of recalibration in a man who has understood that he misidentified what he was dealing with. She looked back. He kept walking. Nathaniel stood beside her until the hall was empty. Then he turned to her and said quietly, "Are you all right?" The question was so simple. After everything, the weeks of preparation, the morning of the assembly, the long public undoing of a man who had believed himself untouchable. After all of it, her husband was standing next to her asking if she was all right. She thought about it honestly. "Yes," she said. "I think I am." He nodded. He looked like he wanted to say more, and was choosing the right words with care, which was new for him. He had mostly been choosing not to speak, rather than choosing what to say. "You were extraordinary in there," he said. "The whole room knew it." "I was prepared," she said simply. "That's all." "Clara." He stopped her gently, not with a hand, just with his voice. "Will you let me walk you to the carriage?" She looked at him. It was such a small thing. A husband walking his wife to the carriage. The most ordinary gesture in the county. And it was the thing she had wanted 6 months ago, without knowing how to name it. Not rescue, not defense. Not a man standing in front of her to block the world. Just this. Someone walking beside her. "Yes," she said. He offered his arm. She took it. They walked out of the assembly hall together into the bright August noon, and she was aware of people watching, because people always watched in a county this size, and she was aware that the watching felt different now than it had at the midsummer dinner. Then she had been watching other people watch her husband, and wondering if she would ever be real to him. Now she was real. She had made herself real through 2 months of work and will and the refusal to disappear, and he was walking beside her. She did not let herself arrive at a conclusion about what that meant. She was a woman who had learned the cost of conclusions drawn too quickly from evidence that was still accumulating. But she kept her hand on his arm, and she did not pull away. The carriage ride back to Ashford Hall was quiet. Not the old quiet, not the managed heavy silence of a man and a woman with nothing to offer each other. Just the quiet of two people who had been through something difficult together and did not need to perform a feeling about it. Halfway home, Nathaniel said without preamble, "I'd like to come with you on the tenant visits next week." Clara turned to look at him. "If you're willing," he added. "I understand if you'd rather." "I'm willing," she said. He nodded. He looked back out the window. She looked back out her own window. The fields were green and recovering. The south drainage work was visible from the road, the new channels cut clean and level, already doing what they were built to do. Water moving where it was supposed to move. Things growing where they were supposed to grow. It had taken 2 months and the full weight of her will. But the ground was changing. She was beginning cautiously to think that she was not the only thing at Ashford Hall that was. The 30 days following the assembly were not peaceful. Clara had not expected them to be. Harrow did not go quietly. Men like Harrow never did. They had too much invested in the architecture of their own importance to simply step back from it, because someone had found a crack in the foundation. He hired a Richmond attorney and filed a counter-complaint with the state land office, challenging the validity of Clara's seal analysis on the grounds that she lacked formal legal training. He sent letters to 2 assemblymen in the state capital suggesting that the Ashford estate had irregularities of its own that warranted investigation. He called in every social debt he had accumulated over 20 years and spent them all in the space of a month trying to rebuild the wall that Clara had knocked down in a single morning. Clara expected all of it. She had prepared for all of it. The day Harrow's counter-complaint arrived, she was already in Richmond with the attorney she had retained 2 weeks earlier, a methodical gray-haired man named Aldous Crane, who had been practicing land law for 30 years, and who, when Clara had laid out her evidence in his office, had looked at her over his spectacles and said, "Mrs. Ashford, in 30 years, I have had perhaps 4 clients who came to me this prepared. 2 of them were sitting judges. I had good source material," Clara had said. Crane had smiled for the first time in what appeared to be a professional habit of not doing so, and said, "Let's get to work." When Harrow's counter-complaint landed on Crane's desk, Crane read it and sent Clara a single-line note. "He's frightened. Frightened men make errors. We wait and we watch." Clara read the note at the breakfast table. Nathaniel was across from her. He had been at the breakfast table every morning for 3 weeks now, which was a change so significant she was still adjusting to it, and he looked up from his coffee. "Crane," he asked. "He says Harrow is frightened." "He should be," Nathaniel said. "He says we wait." Nathaniel considered that. "Can you wait?" Clara looked at him. "I've been waiting since January," she said. 30 more days is nothing." He looked at her steadily. She looked back. And there was something in that exchange, not the defensive sparring of 2 people managing their distance, but the honest shorthand of 2 people who had stopped pretending the last year hadn't happened, and were building something on what remained. The tenant visits had changed things between them in ways that neither had fully articulated. Nathaniel had come on the first one the week after the assembly, as he'd said he would. He had sat at the Hargrove family's table, the family that had been most pressured by Harrow's men, 3 children and a father with a bad leg, and a mother who had been afraid to speak to anyone from the house on the hill, and he had listened. He had not commanded. He had not managed. He had simply sat there with his hat in his hands and listened to what they said, and at the end he had looked at the father and said, "I owe you an apology. The trouble on your land was allowed to continue because I was not paying attention to my own estate. I intend to correct that." The father, a man named Gideon Hargrove, had looked at Nathaniel for a long moment. Then he said, "Mr. Ashford, your wife has been paying attention for the both of you." Nathaniel had not flinched. "I know," he said. "I'm aware of the debt." Clara had looked out the window during that exchange and said nothing. But she had felt something shift, something structural, like a beam settling properly into place after sitting wrong for too long. They went to every tenant family over the following 2 weeks. 6 households. Nathaniel came to all of them. He learned names. He remembered details: which family had the drainage problem on the north edge, which had the sick milk cow, which had the eldest son about to turn 15 and looking for work. He wrote things down in a small notebook he started carrying, which Clara noticed without commenting on. One evening after a particularly long day of visits, they were riding back to Ashford Hall, side by side, and Nathaniel was quiet in a way that was not the old quiet, not the managed absence of a man who had decided not to be present. It was the quiet of a man who was thinking about something and would eventually say it. She waited. "Gideon Hargrove's eldest," he said finally. "The 15-year-old, Thomas." "What about him?" "He's got a good head. His father said he's been keeping the family's accounts since he was 12. Nathaniel paused. "I was thinking when Elias takes on the secondary drainage project next spring, he's going to need an assistant. Someone local who knows the land." Clara looked at him. "I thought I might offer Thomas the position," Nathaniel said. "With wages. Real wages, not the kind that disappear into Harrow's adjustment column." She was quiet for a moment. "That's a good thought," she said. He nodded. He didn't make anything of her saying it. He just nodded and kept writing. That was the thing. She was still learning about this new version of Nathaniel Ashford. He did not perform his changed behavior. He did not announce it, or ask her to acknowledge it, or present it as evidence of his improvement. He simply did it. Every day, something small and real. Coffee at her elbow when she was working late. The notebook of tenant names. A question about the garden that was genuine curiosity rather than polite noise. She was watching all of it. She was filing all of it. She was not yet sure what conclusion she was building toward. But she was honest enough with herself to admit that the conclusion was coming. The letter from the state land office arrived on a Tuesday in late September. Clara was in the East Garden when Josiah brought it out to her. She read it standing there among the roses she had planted in July, which were still in their second bloom, stubborn and fragrant, and refusing to accept that summer was ending. The state land office had reviewed Harrow's counter-complaint and Clara's original seal analysis. They had conducted their own review of the notary records. Their conclusion matched hers precisely. The 1801 document was fraudulent. The petition against Ashford Land was dismissed with prejudice, meaning Harrow could not refile it. Additionally, and this was the part she read twice, then a third time, the office had referred the matter of the fraudulent document and the tenant payment irregularities to the State Attorney General for further investigation. Harrow was not just losing. He was going to be investigated. She stood in the garden holding the letter and took one long, slow breath. Then she walked inside through the kitchen and down the hall and knocked on the study door. "Come in." She opened the door and held up the letter. Nathaniel looked at her face before he looked at the letter. He read her expression, and something in his own face released not dramatically, just a quiet unlocking the way a man looks when he has been holding tension so long he has forgotten it was there. He took the letter and read it. When he finished, he set it on the desk. He looked at her. "It's over," he said. "The land petition is over," she said. "The investigation will take time, but Harrow won't touch this estate again. He has his own problems now." Nathaniel nodded slowly. He looked at the letter for another moment. Then he said, "You did this." "We did this," she said. "You were in that room." "I stood beside you," he said. "You built the case." "The case needed someone to stand beside it," Clara said. "That wasn't nothing." He looked at her directly. "No," he said quietly. "I don't suppose it was." She turned to go. "Clara." His voice stopped her. She turned back. He was standing now, and he was not managing his expression the way he usually managed things carefully, at a controlled temperature. He looked for the first time in her knowledge of him, simply open. Like a man who had run out of the particular kind of pride that keeps a person from saying the thing that needs saying. "I want to tell you something," he said. "And I want you to hear it as a statement of fact, not as a request for anything. Because I've learned this summer that I don't have the right to ask you for things before I've earned them." She waited. "I love you," he said. "I don't know exactly when it started. Somewhere between the garden and the assembly hall. Maybe before that. Maybe I was too afraid to let myself know what I was feeling until you had already proven you didn't need me to feel it." He paused. "I'm not asking you to say it back. I'm not asking you to do anything with it. I just needed you to know." The room was very quiet. Clara stood at the study door and looked at her husband. This difficult, honest, slowly rebuilt man, and felt the full weight of the year pressing against her chest. She thought about the marble column and the candlelight and a debt settled in silk. She thought about the terrace and the one tear and the vow she had made to herself in the dark. She thought about 6 months of invisible work and the moment she had stopped doing it for him and started doing it for herself, which had been the first moment she had ever truly been present in this house. She thought about what it had cost her to survive this year, and what it had cost him to become the man currently standing on the other side of his desk telling her the truth. She said, "Nathaniel, do you know what I needed most when I came to this house?" "No," he said. "Tell me." "Not love," she said. "Not yet. I needed to be real to you. I needed to exist in a room you were also in, and have you register that I was there." She paused. "You couldn't give me that for 6 months. And I understand now why I understand about Rebecca and the grief and the fear. I understand all of it." She held his gaze. But understanding why something happened does not always make the thing itself smaller. "I know," he said. "I am still." She stopped, started again. "I am still deciding who I am in this house. I spent 6 months trying to be your wife the way I thought you wanted. Then I spent 2 months being myself without asking permission. And I am not finished figuring out what that looks like when the crisis is over, and it is just ordinary days. I know that too, he said. What I can tell you, she said, and her voice was steadier than she expected, is that I do not hate you. I never did. And what I feel when you hand me a cup of coffee at midnight and sit down without making me thank you for it. That is something. I don't have a name for it yet, but it is something. He looked at her with the expression of a man receiving something he understands is more than he deserves and is not going to argue with the terms. Something is more than I had in July, he said. Yes, she agreed. It is. She went back to the garden. He let her go. That was the thing she had not expected from him, that when she needed room, he gave it. He did not follow, did not press, did not perform the patience. He simply let her be where she needed to be, and was where she could find him when she came back. It was such a small thing. It was everything. October came in cool and decisive, and the East Garden began its slow preparation for winter, which in Virginia was never as brutal as it was elsewhere, but was still a kind of ending that had to be acknowledged. Clara spent an afternoon covering the rose beds with Josiah's help, the two of them working in companionable quiet. And when they were done, Josiah stood back and looked at what the garden had become over the course of the summer. You know, he said in the way of a man who rarely volunteers observations. Mrs. Rebecca, she had a good garden, but I think this one is better. Clara looked at him. More alive somehow, he said. Then he picked up his tools and went in. Clara stood there for a moment by herself. She thought about Rebecca's journal and the last entry. I hope she is strong. I hope she is patient. I hope she knows what she has, even when he doesn't know how to show it. She thought about a woman she had never met, who had loved the same man differently, and first, and had left a letter on a shelf for a stranger to find. She felt for the first time something like gratitude toward Rebecca. Not the complicated gratitude of a woman acknowledging a predecessor. The simple kind one person to another across the distance of death for being seen before she arrived. She went inside. Nathaniel was in the hallway. He had his coat on. He was holding a second one, hers the heavier wool one she wore in the evenings. The Southfield, he said. The secondary drainage work is done. Elias says it's running clear. I thought if you wanted to see it. She looked at the coat in his hands. She took it. They walked the Southfield together in the October evening, and Elias was there with his lanky frame and his notebook, and he showed them the new channels running exactly as they were designed to run. And Nathaniel asked technical questions, and Clara asked different ones, and Elias answered both with the even competence of a man who was good at his work and comfortable with people who expected him to be. At the end of it, Elias said goodnight and walked back toward the road, and Clara and Nathaniel stood at the edge of the field in the quiet. Thomas Hargrove started Monday, Nathaniel said. I know, Josiah told me. A pause. He came by this garden to introduce himself before he went to find Elias. He took his hat off. Nathaniel almost smiled. His father's raising him right. His father, Clara said, is raising him without enough money on ground that's been under threat for 3 years. But he's raising him right. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. I'm going to propose to the county that the disputed parcel access agreements be formally renegotiated. In the tenant's favor. Crane says the investigation gives us standing to push for it. Clara looked at him. It won't fix everything, he said. But it's something. It's a great deal more than something, she said. He looked at her sideways. You could just agree with me occasionally without the amendment. I could, she said. But then you might stop explaining yourself, and I find it useful when you explain yourself. He did smile then, briefly, but it was real, the kind of smile that doesn't perform itself, that just happens when something lands correctly. She had not seen him smile like that before. She realized, standing in a recovering field in the October evening, that she wanted to see it again. They walked back to the house. At the garden wall, Nathaniel stopped. He looked at the covered rose beds, the cleared lavender rose, the stone path running straight and level. He stood there the way a man stands when he is seeing something clearly for the first time that was always in front of him. I owe you an apology, he said. A real one. Not the version I gave you in the study after the assembly, which was honest but incomplete. She waited. "I called you a debt settled in silk," he said, and he did not look away when he said it, which cost him something she could see. "In front of a room full of people who knew us both. I reduced you to a transaction because it was easier than admitting I was afraid to let you be a person to me." He paused. "There is no version of that I can explain well enough to make it small. It was wrong. It was a cruelty I committed out of cowardice, and you deserved better from the first day you walked into this house." Clara was quiet for a long moment. The weight of that apology, not the easy kind, not the managed kind, but the specific, unflinching. "This is exactly what I did," kind, settled over her differently than she expected. "I know," she said finally. "I know you know," he said. "I needed to say it in those words." She looked at him. At this man who had taken a whole summer and a dead wife's letter, and the testimony of decent people, and the slow, patient work of being shown what he had been missing, and had arrived here at a garden wall in October, saying the exact right thing in the exact right way. "Nathaniel," she said, "ask me again." He looked at her. "Ask you what?" "What you said in the study," she said. "Say it again." I understood immediately. She could see it in his face, the way he received it steadily, without making it more than it was, or less than it was. "I love you," he said. "I have been learning to love you since July, when you put your hands in a ruined garden and started pulling up what was dead, so what was living could breathe. And I have not stopped, not." Clara felt the year move through her, all of it. The marble column, and the one tear, and the 6 months of invisible labor, and the ledgers, and the assembly hall, and the October field, and the small cup of coffee at midnight. And this man, this difficult and finally honest man, standing at a garden wall, saying the thing she had given up hoping to hear. She had not given up hoping entirely. She had just stopped making her survival depend on it. That she understood now was the difference. That was what the summer had given her. Not Nathaniel's love, though she was standing in it. Her own ground. Her own name. Her own proof that she could build something lasting with her own hands. Everything after that was addition, not rescue. She stepped forward. She took his hand, not because she needed steadying, but because she wanted to. There was a difference, and she knew it now in her bones. "I loved you too," she said. "In the beginning, before I knew better than to let it show." He looked at their joined hands. "And now," she said, "I am choosing it, which is different." She met his eyes. "Choosing it is harder. It requires me to believe you will keep being the man you've been these last 2 months. Every day, not just today." "I know," he said. "I need you to know that if you stop," she said, "I will not disappear back into that house the way I did in January. I am not that woman anymore." "I know that too," he said. "I am counting on it." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "All right then." He brought her hand up and pressed it once briefly against his chest, over whatever was happening in there that he still didn't entirely know how to say. She felt his heartbeat steady, present, real. She left her hand there for a moment. Then she turned back toward the house, and he walked beside her, and the night came down over Ashford Hall. The way good things sometimes arrive quietly without announcement, as though they had always been on their way. The harvest supper came 3 weeks later. Clara had organized it, of course she had. But this time, she had asked Nathaniel to organize it with her, and he had sitting across the kitchen table with the housekeeper, and the cook, and the guest list for the tenant families, and the county neighbors, who had stood on the right side of things in the assembly hall. It had been an ordinary planning meeting, practical and efficient, and at one point, they had disagreed about whether to set up the tables in the yard or the barn, given the October weather, and they had argued about it with the comfortable directness of two people who were not afraid of each other's opinions, and in the end, they had done neither, and used the East Hall, which was Clara's compromise, and which Nathaniel admitted was better than either of his options. He said so, out loud, in front of the housekeeper. The housekeeper did not visibly react, but Clara saw her press her lips together in a way that meant she was keeping something in. The supper itself was full in the way Ashford Hall had not been full since before Rebecca died. The Hargrove family came, all 5 of them, and Thomas shook Nathaniel's hand with the seriousness of a 15-year-old who understood the significance of the gesture. The other tenant families filled the East Hall with noise and children, and the particular warmth of people who have been through difficulty together and come out the other side, knowing each other's names. Mrs. Munro arrived late and stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the room, at the full tables, at the children, at Clara, laughing at something the Hargrove mother said at Nathaniel, standing across the room talking to Gideon Hargrove, with the notebook open and a genuine question on his face. She found Clara near the end of the evening. "Well," she said in the way of a woman who has waited a long time to say something and is choosing the economical version. "Well," Clara agreed. Mrs. Monroe looked at her steadily. "You are not what I expected when Nathaniel brought home an arrangement." "No," Clara said. "I don't suppose I am." "You are considerably more than he deserved at the beginning." "At the beginning," Clara said. "So was he in different ways." Mrs. Monroe looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "Rebecca would have liked you." Clara felt that land in her chest. She looked at the older woman. "I think I would have liked her too." Mrs. Monroe nodded once with the finality of a woman closing a long account. She went to find the dessert table. Later, much later, when the families had gone, and the hall was quiet, and the house had the particular exhale of a space that has been properly full for the first time in years, Clara found herself alone in the East Garden. She had not planned to go there. She had simply ended up there the way she always ended up there, the place she had first decided who she was going to be in this house, the place where she had made a vow in the dark, and then spent a summer keeping it. The rose beds were covered for winter. The lavender was cut back. The stone path ran straight and level. She heard his footstep on the path behind her, and she did not turn because she knew it. He came and stood beside her. Not behind her, not in front of her. Beside. They stood in the October dark and listened to the quiet of a house that had finally properly come back to life. "Next spring," she said, "I want to put in a kitchen garden on the south side. Herbs mostly. Some vegetables the tenants can take from." "All right," he said. "And I want to add 2 more drainage channels in the east field before the ground freezes. Elias says if we do it now, the spring planting will be ahead by a full month. I'll tell him tomorrow." "And," she said, and paused. He waited. "I would like," she said carefully, "for this to be a real marriage, not an arrangement, not a performance, a real one with all the difficulty and all the dailiness of it." He turned to look at her. She turned to look at him. "I want that more than I have wanted anything since Rebecca," he said plainly. "And I want to spend however long you give me proving it." She nodded. She slipped her hand into his. He held it not tightly, not desperately, but with the steady, uncomplicated grip of a man who understood finally what he was holding and had no intention of letting it go. They stood in the garden that she had rebuilt from ruin, beside the roses that would bloom again in spring, in the silence of a house that was no longer haunted, not because the past had been erased, but because the people living in it had finally decided to live. That was Ashford Hall's true inheritance. Not the acres or the columns, or the name that carried weight in 7 counties. Not Rebecca's memory, which would always live there gently in the locket, in the desk drawer, and the journal on the study shelf, and the garden that had started as hers and become something new. The true inheritance was this: a woman who had arrived as a transaction and refused to remain one who had put her hands in the dirt and her name on letters and her voice in a county hall, and proved day by ordinary day that dignity is not given, it is built and held and never surrendered. And a man who had been lost inside his own grief and had been found, not rescued, not forgiven cheaply, but found by the patient, clear-eyed courage of a woman who had decided she was worth being seen. Clara Whitmore Ashford had come to Ashford Hall with nothing but her name and her will. She had kept both. And everything else that mattered, the land, the trust, the love built slowly and without shortcuts, she had earned on her own terms, in her own time. That was not a debt settled. That was a life claimed.